Welcome to the second part of the lesson titled The Last Lesson by Alphonse Daudet. We'll continue page number 5, last paragraph. Then from one thing to another, Monsieur Hamel went on to talk of the French language, saying that it was the most beautiful language in the world, the clearest, the most logical, that we must guard it among us and never forget it. Because when a people are enslaved, as long as they hold fast to their language, it is as if they had the key to their prison. Then he opened a grammar and read us our lesson. Here you find that the master praises their mother tongue and goes on to say that the French language is the most beautiful, clearest, and most logical language in the world. He tells the class to guard their language as it is the only way to free oneself from the prison of slavery. If a person knows his mother tongue well, no one can enslave him. Knowing the mother tongue itself is a tool to fight against their enemies. Then the teacher continued with the grammar lesson. I was amazed to see how well I understood it. All he said seemed so easy, so easy. I think too that I had never listened so carefully, and that he had never explained everything with so much patience. It seemed almost as if the poor man wanted to give us all he knew before going away and to put it all into our heads at one stroke. That day, Franz was surprised that he understood the lesson with ease. He felt that he had been so attentive, and the master also explained the lesson with a lot of patience. Franz felt that the teacher wanted to give them all the knowledge he had before leaving, and Franz attended the class with all sincerity. After the grammar, we had a lesson in writing. That day, Monsieur Hamel had new copies for us, written in a beautiful round hand. France, Alsace, France, Alsace. They looked like little flags floating everywhere in the schoolroom, hung from the rod at the top of our desks. You ought to have seen how everyone set to work and how quiet it was. The only sound was the scratching of the pens over the paper. Once some beetles flew in, but nobody paid any attention to them, not even the littlest ones, who worked right on tracing their fish hooks as if that was French too. On the roof, the pigeons cooed very low, and I thought to myself, will they make them sing in German, even the pigeons? After grammar, they had a lesson in writing. The master gave the class new notebooks with beautifully written words on them. Franz felt that there was an air of patriotism in the class, and the notebooks were like flags of France that were floating all around. The entire class was busy writing, and the only sound that could be heard was that of the pen writing on the paper. Once some beetles flew into the class, but no one panicked as everyone was busy writing. The writer carefully considers the pigeons sitting on the roof of the class to be students as well, and wonders whether the Prussians would force even the pigeons to change their language and coo in German. He wants to say that language comes naturally to a being, and it cannot be forced upon anyone, be it the pigeons or the Frenchmen. Whenever I looked up from my writing, I saw Monsieur Hamel sitting motionless in his chair and gazing first at one thing, then at another, as if he wanted to fix in his mind just how everything looked in that little schoolroom. Fancy, for 40 years he had been there in the same place, with his garden outside the window and his class in front of him. Just like that. Only the desks and benches had been worn smooth. The walnut trees in the garden were taller, and the hop vine that he had planted himself twined about the windows to the roof. How it must have broken his heart to leave it all, poor man, to hear his sister moving about in the room above, packing their trunks, for they must leave the country next day. In between his writing, Franz looked at Monsieur Hamel, who sat still and stared at the different things in the classroom in succession as if he wanted to memorize the appearance of everything before leaving. The master had been teaching at the same place for the past 40 years, and the only changes were the desks in the classroom had worn out due to use over the years. The walnut trees in the garden outside had grown taller. The hopvine on the outer wall of the school building had climbed up to the roof. Franz feels that the teacher must be heartbroken to be sent away from a place where he had spent 40 years of his life. But he had the courage to hear every lesson to the very last. After the writing, we had a lesson in history, and then the babies chanted their ba, be, bi, bo, bo, that is their phonetic scripts. Down there at the back of the room, old Hauser had put on his spectacles and, holding his primer in both hands, spelled the letters with them. You could see that he too was crying. His voice trembled with emotion, and it was so funny to hear him that we all wanted to laugh and cry. Ah, how well I remember it, that last lesson. The master remained composed and heard the lesson from the entire class. After the writing task, there was a lesson of history, followed by phonetics, where they all recited the sounds of the letters of the alphabet. Hauser had put on his spectacles and, holding the primer in both his hands, recited the letters with the class. He was crying. His voice trembled as he spoke. Franz had mixed feelings. He found it funny to see how an old man like him was crying and trembling, and on the other hand, he also felt emotional like Hauser did. Franz could never forget this last lesson. All at once, the church clock struck 12, then the Angelus. At the same moment, the trumpets of the Prussians, returning from drill, sounded under our windows. Monsieur Hamel stood up very pale in his chair. I never saw him look so tall. Angelus is a prayer in the church, and it is marked by the ringing of the bell at 12 o'clock. Just then the clock at the church struck 12 and the prayer began. At the same moment, the sound of the trumpets played by the Prussian soldiers who were returning from the drill was heard, and the master's face became dull and colorless as the time had come for the class to get over. He stood straight and motionless, and Franz says that he had never appeared to be so tall. My friends, said he, I, but something choked him. He could not go on. Then he turned to the blackboard, took a piece of chalk, and bearing on with all his might, he wrote as large as he could, Vive la France! Long live France! Then he stopped and leaned his head against the wall, and without a word he made a gesture to us with his hand. School is dismissed. You may go. So here you find the master stood straight and motionless, and Franz says that he had never appeared to be so tall, and he began to speak but could not continue as he was overpowered by his emotions. He took a piece of chalk and wrote the words, Long live France, on the blackboard as large as he could. Then he stopped writing, bent towards the wall, and without speaking anything, signaled the class to leave as the class was over. The historical background of the lesson is Franco-Prussian War, and the story proceeds in the viewpoint of a schoolboy named Franz. It is through him that the writer tells us the story of the French people. The theme of the story is the pain that is inflicted on the people of a territory by its conquerors by taking away the right to study or speak their own language. It is at that moment of time that they realize the significance of mother tongue, and they develop a sudden love for their language and their country. Thus we come to the end of the lesson. Thank you.